Welcome. This is a CAS department tutorial to help students master formatting in APA style. This tutorial focuses on how to format in-text citations in APA style. My name is Jana Kim, and I'm a professor in the Department of Child and Adolescent Studies. This tutorial is split into 3 parts. First, I'll explain why we require students to cite their sources in APA style when writing research papers in the Department of Child and Adolescent Studies. Second, I'll explain when to cite, that is, where in the paragraph should you place your citations. Finally, I'll go over the details about how to cite. In other words, what specific elements are needed to format a citation correctly. And I'll give you some specific examples of how you would cite different sources in the body of your paper. Although we in the CAS department recommend you watch this tutorial at least once in its entirety in the order that it's presented here, at any time, either now or in the future, you can skip directly to the part that is most relevant to your current needs using the table of contents. Click on a button now to get started. Why we cite in APA style. This part of the tutorial explains why your professors in the Department of Child and Adolescent Studies require that you cite your sources in APA style when you write research papers in their classes. There are actually a lot of reasons, too many to explain here. But one basic answer to this question is that in the CAS department, our aim is to help students learn to think and communicate like scientists, social scientists. As scientists, we try to ensure that the claims and statements we make about human development are based on research evidence. As child and adolescent development majors and minors, you will undoubtedly be called upon to provide knowledge, advice, and guidance about children, adolescents, and families. This is going to happen in both in your professional life and in your personal life. We hope you are learning in your classes how important it is that the statements and advice you provide are informed by theory and research evidence. This is especially true when you're asked to write a formal research paper. We don't write research papers based on our personal opinions. We write papers that are based on the large body of knowledge that has been produced about the topic. As a professor in the CAS department, I read a lot of student papers each semester, and when I see someone make a written claim like spanking is harmful to children, or authoritative parenting leads to the best outcomes for children, my automatic reaction is to think, oh really? How do you know that? Who said so? Is this your personal opinion? What research evidence can you show me to back up this point? If a student includes a citation at the end of the sentence, I have a better sense of the answers to those questions, and the argument or statement in the paper appears more credible. APA style is a method of written communication established by the American Psychological Association. One of the things APA style helps us do is document our sources of information in a standardized, predictable way. And by sources, I mean things like journal articles, books, websites, governmental reports, class lecture, things like that. From these sources, we learn definitions, examples, research findings, theories that we then incorporate into our papers. In a research paper, anytime you refer to someone else's work or ideas, you must include an in-text citation of where that idea came from. You don't need to provide a citation for facts or ideas that are common knowledge. For example, if you write, "The United States is a country with great ethnic and religious diversity," that's not a fact that needs a citation, it's common knowledge. But if you wrote, "In the United States, the fastest growing ethnic racial group are people of Asian descent," well, I'd want to see a citation to a credible source to back that point up. Children between 8 and 18 years of age spend an average of 6 to 9 hours per day consuming mass media content. That's not my personal opinion. That's a statistic that's reported by Common Sense Media in 2017. I've cited my source at the end of the sentence. That's the in-text citation. Anytime you include an in-text citation of a source in your paper, you must then include a full reference entry of that source on your paper's reference page. The reference entry tells the reader exactly where you found that source, so the reader can track down that source as well, if desired. So each and every citation that appears in the body of your paper should also be found on your reference page. Likewise, each and every reference entry on your reference page must actually be cited in the body of your paper. It would be an error if you listed a source on your reference page but never actually cited that source in the body of your paper. There should be an exact match between the in-text citations and the reference entries. When we cite our sources in APA style, not only do we show that our statements are evidence-based, but we also give credit to other people's ideas where credit is due. Citing our sources in APA style helps us avoid plagiarism, which occurs when we either intentionally or unintentionally pass off other people's ideas as though they are our own. And the CAS department has a separate tutorial that helps you understand how to avoid plagiarism. This part of the tutorial explains when or where in the paragraph you should place your citation. The rule is that you should cite your source as soon as you mention an idea that comes from it. Too often I see that students wait to cite a source until they've finished describing a research study or explaining a complicated idea, like what you see in this paragraph example. They may discuss the idea or study first in several sentences, and then they place the citation at the end of all those sentences. Or they may even wait to cite the source until the very end of the paragraph. Pause this part of the tutorial to read this paragraph in its entirety if necessary. This is an incorrect example. Waiting until the end of the paragraph to cite your source of information is a common mistake. Instead, the rule is that you cite your source as soon as you mention someone else's work or idea. Let's look at a correct example. Researchers tested which type of rules and strategies parents were most likely to attempt at reducing children's exposure to problematic television content. Ramos, Carrick, and Espinoza, 2018. Now I'm going to discuss this study in a bit of detail, but notice that I've cited it as soon as I mentioned what the researchers were studying. Research finds spanking is harmful to children? Cite your source at the end of that sentence. Authoritative parenting leads to positive outcomes? Cite your source immediately after you state this claim. So cite your sources right away as soon as you mention someone else's work or ideas. Then if you're continuing to develop or explain that work or idea, you don't need to cite the source again unless you either switch to a new idea or switch to referring to a different study or source. For example, in this sample paragraph, I'm discussing a study that was conducted by Ramos, Carrick, and Espinoza. I've cited the study as soon as I mentioned it. As the paragraph goes on, it's clear I'm providing details about their study. I don't need to cite the study after every sentence as I mention who the participants were, how the data were collected, or what the results were. One citation is fine. Pause this recording to take the time to read through the entire paragraph. Now, if I were to relate their findings to a different study, then I would need to cite that new study as soon as I mention it. This finding is consistent with previous studies which have shown that children's media use tends to be a quite privatized experience. Strasburger et al., 2014. And then, if I were then to switch back to the Ramos et al. Study, I'd need to cite the original authors again. The researchers speculated that an obstacle to parents' involvement in their children's media use is that children access content on demand on a variety of mobile handheld devices. Ramos et al., 2018. Now I'm referring back to a point made by Ramos and her colleagues, and then I continue elaborating on how they found that point or came to this conclusion. It's the same point and the same study, so I don't need to include another citation in the final sentence of that paragraph. Still feeling a little unsure about when you should cite your source? Click on the button below for another example. If you feel like you understand the rule, click on the button that will take you to the instructions on how to cite in APA style. I've created another fictitious paragraph to illustrate these rules about when to cite your sources. Researchers have recently found dogs are smarter than cats. Mejia, 2017. Here I mention the citation as soon as I mention a claim that needs to be backed up by research evidence. Dogs are smarter than cats, I cite my source. Then I describe the study that Mejia performed. I'll cite the study again just to let the reader know who conducted the study. Mejia, 2017, performed agility tests with both animals and showed that dogs were able to jump through hoops, swim through pools, and climb through tunnels at their owner's command. Cats, on the other hand, completed none of these tasks and instead sat in the middle of the obstacle course licking themselves clean. Dogs also showed an ability to understand basic instructions such as sit, stay, or lie down, whereas cats stared at their owners blankly as though they couldn't understand what their owners were saying. As I describe this study about dogs' intelligence, I don't need to cite the study again. The reader assumes correctly that I'm discussing the same study. Some researchers believe that cats are simply less obedient or less treat-oriented than dogs, arguing their inability to complete agility courses should not be a sign of their intelligence. Marshall and Goodman, 2015. When I raise someone else's point, it's not that cats aren't smart, it's just they don't do agility courses. I then need to cite the source of this competing idea, Marshall and Goodman, 2015. However, Mejia, 2017, disagrees, noting that even dogs that were not interested in treats or praise showed greater ability to follow commands and complete tasks requiring advanced cognitive skill. So I'm going back to Mejia's argument, and so I cite her again. Moreover, dogs were found to be friendlier than cats, Mejia, 2017. The reason I cite Mejia 2017 again at this point is that I'm now mentioning a new idea. So it actually comes from the same source, Mejia 2017, but it's shifting ideas, now referring to the friendliness of the animals, not their intelligence. So I'm going to cite Mejia 2017 again since it's a brand new idea. And then as I expand on that idea with more details, I don't need to cite Mejia 2017 again. They were much more likely to wag their tails, lick their owners, and approach strangers compared to their feline counterparts. Can you tell I'm a dog person? These ideas do not reflect the opinions of all your professors in the CAS department. So as a general rule, it's better to overcite than to undercite. So if you're in doubt, the safe choice is to cite the source again. However, what you see from this example is that it is absolutely not necessary that every sentence in your paragraph has a citation at the end of it. How we cite in APA style. Citing sources in APA style is not very tricky as long as you remember a few rules. First and foremost, APA style uses the author-date method. You give credit to all the authors of the study by their last names, and you follow the author's last names with the year of publication. Notice what is not included in this citation. You never mention the first names of the authors. You never include the name of the article. You never include the name of the journal. So it would not be correct APA style to write, Ramos, Carrick, and Espinoza published a study in the Journal of College Studies that found blah, 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 blah. That wastes space. If the reader wants that information, like the name of the journal or the article title, he or she can go to the reference page entry on the reference page to find those details. We also never mention the author's first names in an APA style citation. So we do not write, Michelle Ramos, Natalie Carrick, and Lupita Espinoza conducted a study, blah, blah, blah. Nor do we write, Ramos, Carrick, and Espinoza, professors or PhDs at California State University, Fullerton. None of that. We simply write the author's last names and the year of publication. Author's last names and year. Author's last names and year. Ramos, Carrick, and Espinoza, 2018. Second rule. In using the author date method, the author's name and year of publication should always be kissing. I give credit to Wendy Mages from Harvard University for this tip. What kissing means is that the author's last names and year of publication should always be placed right next to each other. Think of these cute bunny rabbits when writing APA citations in the body of your paper. Just like these adorable little bunnies, the author and the year should always be right next to each other. Mention an author, follow it directly with the year. This is true even if you just mentioned the year 2 sentences ago or in the previous paragraph. Here's another example paragraph from my sample paper, and the in-text citations are highlighted in yellow. Just last names, year. Last names, year. Author, year. Always kissing. I've noticed some online resources say you don't need to include the year again once you've mentioned it once. But in writing and reading actual APA published research articles, I find it's most common to include the year whenever the author name is mentioned. So we ask you to do the same. Now let's talk about where in the sentence you place the citation, and you have a few options. One option is to place the citation at the end of the sentence. What's important here is that you pay attention to the punctuation and the placement of the citation. The citation, enclosed within parentheses, is placed before the period ending the sentence. This is an important rule. Some professors will say that the preferred placement of a citation is usually at the end of the sentence in parentheses. That's because when it appears at the end in parentheses, the reader doesn't really need to read it as the main part of the sentence. So if I were a professor reading this paper, I'd read, "Spanking is harmful to children." I'd make a mental note that you put a citation there to back your point, but I kind of skim over the names in my head. The second option is to mention the author's names directly in the beginning of the sentence, so their names are actually more prominent and are actually read as part of the sentence. So when I read this sentence example in my head, I can't skim over the author names because they're part of the sentence. And this is a perfectly fine way to cite your source. Notice you still make the year kissing the author's names, but now you put the year in parentheses. In the end, you decide how much prominence you want to give to the author's names. In most cases, placing the citation at the end of the sentence is totally fine. Usually, when I'm writing, I only mention the author's names in the sentence itself if I'm going to discuss the study in detail or if it's an especially important source on which I'm basing a key argument. Finally, you can also add the year to the text of the sentence itself. If the year is part of the sentence, you don't use parentheses, as in this example. In 2013, McKinsey et al. Found spanking is harmful to children. You might write the sentence in this way if you wanted to call attention to the year the study was published. If it's not that important, it's generally preferable to put the year in parentheses. However, again, all 3 of these options are perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's good to have sentence variety. So try changing up the way you cite your sources throughout your paper. Variety makes your papers more interesting to read. Let's take another look at that sample paper I wrote for more examples. Pause this recording to closely examine these citations and how they exemplify the rules of citation we've just covered. One important note about the placement of these citations has to do with the ampersand. An ampersand is an and sign. Take a look at these 3 examples highlighted in yellow. When the citation has more than one author and it appears in parentheses at the end of the sentence, you use an ampersand. But if the citation appears in the actual sentence itself, that is not in parentheses, then you actually spell the word and out. Here's another example using an ampersand. Again, when the citation appears in parentheses, you use the ampersand. When the citation appears in the actual sentence, you spell out and. The final rule for in-text citations is that you must give credit to all the authors on a source. The rules for how to format the in-text citation differs based on how many sources or how many authors are actually listed on a source. So these rules have to do with when you get to use that abbreviation at all. The bottom line is that we want to give credit to all the authors of a source. For example, this article was written by Ramos, Carrick, and Espinoza. We can't only give credit to the first author. which is what we'd imply if we dropped all the other authors' names and started referring to the study as Ramos 2018. Carrick and Espinoza would be like, "What? Where's my name? I did work on this study." So we need to give credit to all the authors on the study. Click on the button below to see the different citation styles. When a source has one author, you cite the author by last name and date throughout the paper. The author and the date are kissing. Do not ever use the author's first name. Here's an example of a paragraph that has multiple citations to a single authored study. Click on the button below to see the different citation styles. When a source has two authors, whenever you cite the source in your paper, you always mention both authors' last names. Both names throughout the entire paper. Always. Both authors get credit for this study by name. It doesn't matter how many times I cite this article in my paper, I will always refer to its two authors. Russell and Russell, 2009. I can cite this source multiple times in this paper in different paragraphs, always going to call it Russell and Russell, 2009. Click on the button below to see the different citation styles. When a source has 3 to 5 authors, the first time you mention this source, you mention all the authors' last names. Give credit where credit is due. Citations are like a currency from a researcher's perspective. We want to see our name in print. But because the citation style can become quite long when there are more than 2 authors on a source, after that first citation, we then switch to using the abbreviation et al., which is Latin for and others. Now we are still signaling to the reader that this source has multiple authors, but we don't have to write out every name over and over and over again. This is a critical point. Do not simply drop the authors' names from your citation. Show the reader that there are multiple authors by using et al. And note the punctuation here. The period goes after the AL. No period after ET. Everything in lowercase. Use et al. For the entire rest of the paper whenever you cite this source after the first time. Doesn't matter if you break to a new paragraph. Doesn't matter if you're 6 pages away from the first time you cited that source. Doesn't matter if you've cited a different source in between and then have come back to the source again. The first time you cite this study with 3 to 5 authors, you mention all authors' last names. The second time and every single other time you cite this study throughout your entire paper, you use the first author's last name plus et al. To give credit to the remaining authors. And as always, your author and date must be kissing. Click on the button below to see the different citation styles. Sources with 6 or more authors. When a source has 6 or more authors, you skip directly to the et al. Citation style. Et al. Is Latin for and others. It's a way of signaling to the reader that there were multiple authors on a particular source. Every single time you cite a source with 6 or more authors in your paper, the first time, the second time, the third time, and every other time, you mention just the first author's last name and then et al. Do this throughout your entire paper. Use the first author's last name plus et al. And as always, your author and date must be kissing. Click on the button below to see the different citation styles. Sometimes you may have 2 or more sources that support a single point. Do you choose just one of those sources, or can you cite all of them at once? It's actually great to cite multiple sources to support a single point. It shows that your sources tie together and that you've done the work of synthesizing this information. Here's how you format multiple citations in a single sentence. Place the citations in alphabetical order based on the last name of each source's first author. So Russell comes before Strasburger, and Strasburger comes before Wright. So place Russell first, Strasburger second, and Wright last. Then separate these entries with a semicolon. A reminder that alphabetization takes into consideration only the first author of a source. For an explanation of why we never change the order of authors within a source, click on the button below. Citing secondary sources. When we cite a source, we imply to the reader that we have personally read the source or work. Sometimes, however, we learn about an original source from someone else's work that was published afterward. We've read that subsequent work, but we haven't personally read the original work. For example, maybe you haven't read Piaget's original book from 1932 describing his theory of children's moral development, but you read an article published in 2013 that describes Piaget's work. In your paper on moral development, you want to describe Piaget's ideas, but perhaps you're unable to track down that original book. So then you can use the article published in 2013 as a secondary source. Before I show you how you would format a citation to a secondary source, I want to provide this warning. Many CAS professors do not allow you to use secondary sources on your assignments. They want you to cite only articles, books, and other sources that you have personally read. So you need to check with what policy your professor has about secondary sources in your particular course. Why wouldn't secondary sources be allowed? Well, one reason is that if you haven't read the original work firsthand, how can you be sure that the information you've learned about that source is accurate? When you use a secondary source, you're relying on someone else's interpretation of the original work, and there can be problems with that. Ideally, you would track down the original source, the one you read about in that subsequent source, and you'd read that original source and then cite that source in your paper. Tracking down articles and books is actually pretty easy. Just look at the subsequent sources list of references, then log into the Pollock Library to find or request an electronic version of the original source. It often just takes a few minutes to track down that original source. Some professors will allow a limited number of secondary sources in your paper, maybe 1 or 2. Or they may only allow secondary sources if you've shown a really good effort to track down that original work. Again, always check with your professors to see what rules they have about secondary sources in their classes. To cite a secondary source in the body of your paper, you will refer both to the original work and the secondary source using this citation style. One early theory described 2 stages of children's moral development, Piaget, 1932, as cited in Ma, 2013. Ma is the author of the subsequent work. So I've cited the original work first, followed by the secondary source, which is the article that I've actually read firsthand. Then on the reference page, I need to include only my secondary source, Ma, 2013, the article that I read. I do not need to include an entry to the original work on my reference page. Now you know how to create in-text citations in APA style in your papers. Here's a recap of some of the most important points covered in this tutorial. Cite your source as soon as you mention someone else's work or idea. Do not wait until the end of the paragraph. Use the author-date method of citation. Don't include any other information. The author and date should always be kissing. Citations that are in parentheses go before the period at the end of the sentence. For sources with 1 or 2 authors, always list the author's last names throughout the paper. For sources with 3 to 5 authors, use the author's last names the first time you cite it, mention all of them, but then switch to using et al. For the rest of the paper. For sources with 6 or more authors, use et al. The first time you cite that study and every other time you cite that study. All citations in your text must be listed on your reference page. Every single entry on your reference page must actually be cited in the body of your paper. Congratulations, you've learned how to format in-text citations in APA style.